Welcome to Books on Air, the podcast that tells the story behind the book. It includes insights from authors about how they compose their work, what inspires them, and what they hope you'll take away from their book. Here's your host for this episode of Books on Air, Suzanne Harris.
Welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm Sloan Fremont, filling in for Suzanne Harris. This is a podcast where listeners get the secret story behind every book. Joining me today is Maggie Charters, author of I Am Kellie Earl, Peace Carries a Cost. Set in Melbourne in the 60s, this psychological thriller shows the plight of Russian migrants and the damage caused by cycles of abuse within families and when nations go to war. By withdrawing into her fantasy world and later writing best-selling novels, Kellie Earl has been able to protect herself from a harsh reality. When she lands in a women's prison after confessing to murdering her stepfather, souls are laid bare and friendships form. Kellie begins to find peace, but she always seeks answers to universal questions. Who is to blame for the downfall of humanity, and why can't we all just get along? Maggie, welcome to the Books on Air podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Good morning, Sloan. Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, so those questions, who is to blame for the downfall of humanity and why can't we all just get along, are such universal questions. But let's start out by telling the audience just a little bit about yourself and what led you to write your book.
Well, I have been a social worker and I'm a teacher. I've taught psychology and English, and I've had issues with family members and friends with mental health problems. And my dad had paranoid schizophrenia, and I was always looking for answers to why people get sick. And so, of course, whenever I write stories or plays or films, my characters are always dealing with mental health issues, which is what happens to Kellie Earl, and that's her downfall. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so is Kellie, is this based on a true story?
No, it's not true. No, not at all. No, all the characters, and there's some very dark characters who come out light. We see behind their foil, we see, what sort of led them to their downfall, like in the prison system, and I tried to show people that there's good in everyone and don't judge a book by its cover. And so when we meet people with problems in the prison system and outside of the prison system, I try and let the reader see behind them what led to their downfall and what caused their psychological challenges, for want of a better word.
Yeah, so it sounds like you show the humanity of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, I love people. I'm fascinated with people. I've got 3 children, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-granddaughters, and, I love people, and I'm interested in the interactions between people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about Kellie Earl in your book.
Well, Kellie Earl, she's a writer, and she finds that writing stories from an early age is her escape mechanism because she has an abusive stepfather who sexually abuses her, and she can't tell her mother because they're financially dependent on him. So Kellie writes stories. That's her escape mechanism from her harsh world. And she's really good at it, and she gets awards. And when she gets married, she gets out of the home, and she writes books, best-selling books. But when her husband dies, her world sort of falls apart, and then ultimately she wants revenge on the stepfather. So I'm not allowed to tell too much. I'm not allowed to give the plot away, but it's dealing with, she's a writer, and it's how she sees the world. And so even when she goes to prison, she tries to put everything into perspective and writes a book and puts all the prisoners in, or some of the prisoners in her book, and they're really excited, and they're all telling her their story. And it's, a sort of, she's spoiled for choice in the prison system with who you can talk to. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And so when you were writing your book, and is some of maybe the history behind the prison system or how people are treated in the prison system, was that based on research, or did you have no specific examples of things people went through?
Oh, well, it was a bit before my time, the prison system in, Fairley Women's Prison, but it is based on research, a lot of research, what happened. So that's very realistic, how the people were treated. And I've tried to make the whole book historic, about Melbourne and about Sydney, and what it was like in the earlier days.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
to make it educational.
Yeah, right. And so we can learn something about
Definitely.
not only the characters but the setting as well.
Definitely. Oh, definitely. And it's also because I'm, interested in psychology and philosophy, I've got a lot of philosophy in it, because when Callie's in prison, she has time to engage in reading books on philosophy, and she sort of tries to analyze all the prisoners, and while she's doing that, it gives the reader insights into what the philosophers used to think in days of old, and how their thinking is still very relevant to today, because people basically haven't evolved. We're still the same as we were hundreds of years ago. We still feel all the same emotions. So everything that was written centuries ago is still very relevant today.
Right. And that what you were talking about earlier about showing the humanity of people, right? They're more than their whatever their situation is, right? And people always do things for reasons that to them make sense at the time, right? And it's easy to overlook what somebody has is that's that human side of somebody when they've done something wrong, maybe that leads them into prison.
Well, yeah, and particularly with George, he's sort of the arch villain, who led to Callie's downfall, because she does kill him for revenge, but also we'll feel sympathetic towards him because as his story unfolds, we see what led to him being like he is. He's a bit like the Joker. If you've seen the film The Joker, we sort of feel sorry for the Joker. He's a very flawed character. And George is very much the same. He's very evil, but he's also, we see him as a child. We see his history and what led to his downfall. And the same is true with the people in prison, the women, like those who've killed their family, or I'm not allowed to give the story away, but there's some very dark characters, but they're also very kind people, so they have a strong capacity to hate, but they also have a strong capacity to love. And that's what I'm trying to show, that doesn't matter what people do, they can always be forgiven. There's always hope for people.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite scenes that you wrote about in the book?
Oh, gee, I'm going to cry when the mum dies. Oh, I cry every time I think about that.
Yeah.
That's because the mum, she's always very closed and she won't talk about Russia. And Kellie needs to know about her history, but the mum won't talk about it because something really awful happened. So she has to shut that part of her mind down. And, of course, eventually she tells Kellie before she dies. And I was like, wow, this is, full on, and the mum dies. And, Kellie, although she has a hatred towards her mum because she sort of half blames her mum for not helping her when she was abused, because the mum didn't know, she was there but absent. And so, but when the mum's dying, Kellie's thinking, well, I need my mum. Mama, don't die,
Right. Yeah. So what surprised you the most about your book?
Well, I gave it a happy end. And the reason I did that, I have a happy end to my story, of course. I've got a wonderful husband. So I thought Callie's going to have a happy end.
Yeah.
But I'd read the book Jude the Obscure, and it has a terrible end, and all the critics of the time were up in arms. And I remember when I studied that book at uni, I thought, okay, I'm not going to do the same to my readers. Callie's going to have a happy end to her story. I'm going to give it a romantic end. But of course, when you read it, you don't really know if that's really the end or if she's just imagining the end. So I'm not going to tell you.
Right.
So you have to read it and you work out for yourself if that's real or imagined. Yeah. Because the book flips between reality and fantasy as she's writing. Yeah.
I see.
I know, but I'm not going to tell you.
So tell us what was the most difficult to write about?
The most difficult to write. Well, the whole book was a challenge because it tapped on lots of triggers in my life. I put, like I remember little stories people had told me. And so I had to get the timing right in the book, the historicity right, and I had to make sure all the characters were believable and, credible, and so that was challenging to me to do that, and I had to make sure that I tied off all the loose ends, that the readers weren't thinking, well, what happened to so-and-so, where did they go? It's not like other stories, like we see dramas on telly where children just seem to disappear in storylines and, because it suits the plot. And I had to make sure all the loose ends were tied off so people can read the book from beginning to end and they say, yeah, I know what happened to Kellie's brother, which I'm not allowed to tell you because it's a surprise, or I know what happened to her friends. And, I had to make sure everything fitted in correctly and, it's like a big jigsaw, really. I had to put all the pieces together. But as I'm putting the pieces of my book together, Kellie's putting the pieces of her book together because the book is really her story. It's not my story, it's her story. And so we see it through her eyes, the eyes of probably someone who's a walking wounded woman who she's classified as mentally insane. And so, that's what we have to understand as we read the book. But lots of sensitive moments, lots of love scenes, bonding between the women in the prison, situations there evolve, and which I have to not tell too much. And, so it's a lot packed into the book, a lot of stories in the book.
It sounds like it. Yeah.
I wanted to, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You go. No, but I just had so much I wanted to say, and I had to make sure I got it all together in the book that, everything was said that needed to be said. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because like you said, that is when you read something or you watch something and somebody disappears or there's a loose storyline that doesn't get closed off, that leaves you like, well, wait, what happened? I was vested in this. I want to know what happened. I want to see how this finishes.
Yeah, well, see, and of course, Kellie commits a perfect crime, which is part of the whole story. She gets away with a murder because she's actually, very, very intelligent, and she can fool everyone, but she can't fool herself, and that's why she ultimately confesses. But so she takes everyone on a wild goose chase, and so that's another element. So it's got the crime, it's got the psychological aspects, it's got the crime, it's got the relationships, and of course a huge big theme in the book, because I've got a postgrad in psych and education. It's the nature nurture debate. Are we a product of our environment, or are we genetically disposed? Is it, we do things because our grandparents did things, and it's in our genes, we can't help ourselves. So who are we going to blame for our downfall? And I'm trying to get people to, reflect on themselves. It's not just about the characters. It's about, I'm trying to challenge the readers to think about their lives and the things they do or shouldn't do,
Yeah. And we asked at the beginning when I read the intro, I mentioned how the character Kellie is always seeking the answers to the universal questions. Who is to blame for the downfall of humanity, and why can't we all get along? Do you think those questions were answered for her in this book?
Well, I think Kellie, at the end, she has an acceptance of people as they are. She looked at all the philosophers and what they said, and she sort of put it all together in her mind. And I think she finds peace. She's a very troubled person, but by the end of the book, she finds peace, and she comes to terms with herself and her life and her mother, which she has big problems with her mother, and her stepfather. And, she finds her history, who her real birth father was, and she sort of understands herself. So she realizes that we are a composite of our genes and our environment, that, we, who we mix with forms us. And also, when Kellie finds out her history, she thinks, well, wow, I'm like this because my mother was like this, or, my father was like this, and she sort of has a better understanding of herself. And I think the reader will ultimately have a better understanding of themselves.